When I think of my nostalgia for Sands of Destruction, I remember a fun JRPG that had my style of humor. I also remember a pretty solid story and a fun combat system that overall created a game I enjoyed. And after rewatching my playthrough, I've decided to place it behind Persona 5. Here's why. While playing through the game, I did have some familiarity with it since it was my second time going through it. I remembered characters and some key plot points that might have caused some events to be less impactful. Regardless of that fact, I still found myself undeterred from playing it and even encountered some barriers to my surprise. Since the story was fairly familiar to me in some aspects, I didn't comment much on it. However, the combat felt very foreign to me, and that was where much of my commentary occurred. In my thoughts of the game, I remarked that the story was okay, but the combat and gameplay of the game is where I found both excitement and bewilderment. I enjoyed what felt like a fresh take on the turn-based combat system, where I had a certain allotment of battle points that I could spend to do actions. It felt nice to figure out some of the depth in the combat system, and it felt rewarding to engage in. However, there was also a lot of confusion. Admittedly, I didn't read the manual for the game, so many of the mechanics were lost on me. The morale system, which I could never seem to figure out, gave me a lot of trouble as characters would start the battle with one battle point and it would stay that way for the rest of it. Turn order was also a very large enigma and very frustrating to deal with. Ally turns would disappear, ally turns would miraculously appear, and enemy turns would cut in line for seemingly no reason. This caused no end of grief to my playthrough and even caused game overs. To make matters worse, there didn't seem to be any commonality as to why it was happening despite running a few experiments. Ultimately, I had felt the game was something I liked, but it felt very short of what I hoped it would do. It failed to be memorable despite the fact that we were the bad guys for such a large portion of the game. For the rewatch, I found myself agreeing with effectively every point my past self made. It was neat to be the bad guys, but it didn't last the whole way through. The story's elements were actually very fascinating though, Kyrie being a program of sorts that is designed to reset the world, and admittedly they reveal those aspects in an effective way. I believe that the biggest downfall of the game is the gameplay. The dungeons were riddled with practical dungeon design issues and made their traversal quite frustrating to go through. Puzzle elements felt drawn out, especially when coupled with random encounters. Locations like the Tower of Light, Depths of Memories, Clockwork Manor, and the Ark felt unnecessarily stretched out with unneeded padding. In fact, the final dungeon is by far the most egregious, where both my past self and I agreed that its design was frustrating. Forcing a door unlock puzzle with irritating traversal, only to force the player to retread that same area 3 more times to unlock another door, was going too far. I would also agree with my past self that the combat was cool, but that quickly lost its allure once the Azure Sea fight was reached. At that point, my past self had fortified flurries on Taupi, but wasn't using him at the time. This particular boss fight felt impossible without him, where the boss would out-heal the damage output of the team with no end in sight. This effectively meant that fortified flurries were a requirement to progress and left some large balancing issues in its wake. Encounters would be extreme pushovers or overly tuned. Boss fights would feel non-threatening due to the high damage output characters were achieving. The only times where bosses would put up a fight were moments where they felt like they were cheating. They'd get turns for no discernible reason, acquire absurd amounts of battle points, and even position themselves to have multiple turns in a row. Based on memory, I ranked Sands of Destruction at 48 out of 117, and this one is a bit of a tragic case. The game has great ideas, and even the execution of some of those ideas are spot on. However, it really struggles to balance the rocket tag nature of the combat, the annoying design of its dungeons, and push its narrative into something memorable. That in turn causes this game to not quite hit the mark, so I think this comes up behind Persona 5. Even though some of its ideas like battle points, quips, character building, and attack customization are quite cool, it really does fall behind on the fun factor. If Fortified Flurries is the only viable option in the game, that doesn't leave much interest in engaging in the combat, which was 44% of my playthrough.